Hello and welcome to another game of Trap Chess. Today's game mode will be Chaos Chess. Chaos Chess uses all of the landmines hidden inside the board at random. Friendly fire is also on. This means that either side can lose a chess piece to a landmine, even if it isn't the proper color. All landmines affect both players. It looks like white and black are both fighting for the center of the board. Black has a pawn on c5 and their knight behind it on c6. That puts double coverage on the d4 and b4 squares, with the knight and the pawn attacking. Now it seems the first piece has been lost by black on the g6 square. A bomb pawn landmine has activated and black lost a pawn. Early landmine activations disrupt the development of pieces. Here's another landmine activation on the b5 square. What's interesting is black really didn't have a way to avoid hitting that landmine with their pawn on the b file, but because white crossed over to attack the knight, now black doesn't have to worry about hitting it, and unless there is a landmine for pawns on the b1, 2, or 3 squares, black will actually be able to run that pawn all the way up to become a queen later in the game, without having to worry about losing it to landmines. When playing Chaos Chess, you get to look at the squares you land on. That means your opponent doesn't know what's under those squares unless they land on them too. So seeing a pawn move from the b2 to the b4, then the b5 squares, tells black that their black pawn will be safe for most of the b's. This is great because bees are a keystone species that must be protected. Black has brought both of their knights towards the center of the board. This means the knights will be covering a lot of squares. Oh, and it looks like another bomb pawn has activated on the d4 square. White now has lost 2 pawns to landmines, while black has only lost 1. That means black has been given a 1-point advantage from the landmines against white, and also an extra move. Knowing that black has been given an advantage, it seems as though black is getting more aggressive with moving the knight to the f4 square and putting their queen on the h4 square. White is attempting to protect that right side with their queen, but they're going to be pushed away by black moving their knight to the e5 square. Now their queen is going to be in a situation where it could be put in danger quite a bit because of the positioning of the knights and the sheer number of squares those knights are hitting. If any of the squares that the knights landed on had bomb knight landmines on them, then black's attack would have been disrupted and white wouldn't have had to worry about being so defensive. White putting their queen on the c5 square was a mistake because of the knight's positioning. Now, after that first fork and the bishop taking the knight on the d3 square, black will be able to take the bishop back and fork the king and the queen. White has no way to avoid losing their queen now because of the fork. Black's aggression is paying off as they take white's queen. White is still in the game though. They have a lot of other pieces, and sometimes all it takes to turn a game around is a single landmine activation. When I assemble these games, I see how Stockfish feels about the moves that are made, and you can see things like the change in advantage for each player when a landmine activates, as well as how bad I am at chess. I'm happy to be humbled by a program called Stockfish because it reminds me to just keep swimming. A bomb knight landmine has removed black's knight while black was trying to protect their bishop on the d2 square, so now they lost their knight and their bishop. That means black spent a turn losing their knight, so white was able to spend their turn gaining a bishop. Sometimes the after effects of a landmine can affect you in other ways, as seen by this bishop loss. Black attempts to bring their rook into play on the g file, but they lose their rook. Originally, that was opened up by them losing a pawn on the g file, so it worked well to bring the rook out. However, now they bring their queen over and they lose their queen on the c4 square. This turns the tide of the game around. That's a swing of 14 points in just a couple moves. Black had a big advantage, but now that they've lost so many high-value pieces to landmines, it's white that has the advantage. Black has pinned white's knight on the e2 square because their king on the f1 square would be in danger if the knight moved. Pins are a great way to prevent your opponent from using pieces. White moves their king to the g2 square to attempt to get out of the pin, but now Black is able to put their bishop on the c6 square. This sets up an X-ray attack, where they're aiming for the rook on the h1 square. Black put their rook on d3, so now their rook intercepts with the bishop on the f3 square. White attempts to push the rook away, but black is just going to move to the f3 square with their bishop, and now the rook on the h1 square will be lost. Even if white tries to protect the rook with their king so they can take the bishop back, it won't work. Black has the move with the rook to the d1 square. That'll make it so that the king has to move out of the way, and the bishop will be able to take the rook on the h1 square for free. For free doesn't necessarily mean for free, because there could be a bishop landmine on the h1 square, but it looks like it's safe. White appears to be playing more defensively right now. Maybe they're afraid of losing a high value piece to a trap, and they're using their king as a scout to check squares, or they're just trying to get their king into a spot where it won't be as easy to check. Keeping the king on a dark square is more favorable than keeping it on a light square for white. Bishops can't switch colors, so by keeping it on a dark square, the bishop won't ever be able to attack the king. At this stage in the game, it's worth it to start taking out some pawns. If a single pawn gets across to the other side of the board, it can become a queen, and that'll really change the tide of this game. Black makes a mistake here by taking the pawn on the a3 square, while their bishop is under attack by the rook. So white takes advantage of that and takes the bishop on the e4 square, and now black is at a severe disadvantage. They really need to get a pawn across the board to stand a chance here. White puts their bishop on the c5 square. That's going to attack the rook on the a3 square and prevent the pawn from moving to b4. Black counters by attacking the bishop by moving their rook to the c3 square, so white takes the pawn on the a7 square. Black moving their pawn to the f5 square to threaten the rook won't do anything, because the rook has a line on the king on the e file. The pawn on e6 won't be able to take back on f5. That means the black pawn on e6 can be taken for free, and it moves white one step closer to getting a queen. Now, if there is a bomb pawn landmine on e7, white would lose their pawn before it becomes a queen, but here black makes another blunder by putting their king on f6. White is then able to fork the king and the rook, so the rook is going to be taken. In this situation now, the best black can hope for is a draw. It doesn't look like it will be a draw though, considering white would have to lose most of their pieces to landmines. White moves their bishop to b4 to check the black king and prevent the pawn on b5 from moving any further. This also limits black to only moving their king. White is going to promote their pawn on the e file. It's best that they check the square after promoting the pawn, because pawn landmines are the most common landmines and they are laid at random. If they check it before and it is a pawn landmine, they would lose their pawn before it's promoted. If e8 had a bomb queen landmine though, they would have lost their queen after it was promoted because they checked it after. White has forced black's king into the corner, so the next move will be checkmate. Thank you for watching.